Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to be finishing up our discussion on the weighted voting systems today. So we're going to see a few more examples of the Bonshoff Power Index, and then we're finally going to tie this thing back to probably the election that's most important to us, which is our presidential election. We see how the weighted voting ties into what we do here in the U.S. Okay. So let's take a look here first at example 6. We're going to talk about the Scottish Parliament system that we've looked at before. If you recall, the quota was 65 and the weights of the individual players are listed here for us. So we got 47, 46, 17, 16, and 2. Now, it was nice, and I went ahead and listed the winning coalitions for you. So our job is to determine which players are critical and then determine a power index for this voting system, because we want to see who has the power in this election, all right, or in this voting system. So what we're going to do next, and I'll do a couple with you, and then we'll fast forward so that way you're not watching me do a bunch of addition problems here. But to figure out who is going to be critical, we first need to know what the weight of each of these coalitions are. So I would go through and I would say, okay, well, player one's got 47 votes and player two's got 46 votes. So when I add up their total votes or their total weight, I'm going to get 93. And I just like to write the weights next to each of the coalitions. So one more here for you. So player 1, 2, and 3, I would add up 47, 46, and 17. And when I do that, I'll get a 110. All right, so we're going to do the same thing for each of these coalitions. All right, so there we go. I've got them all added up so I can see the weights of each one. And now we want to go through and determine who is critical. So if we find a critical player, what we'll do is we'll just circle them. That way we can easily count them later. All right, so if you are critical, it means that if you're critical, you're in a coalition and you leave that coalition, you go from a winning coalition to a losing coalition. So for instance, in our first coalition here, if player one were to leave this coalition, I would have to take 47 votes away from my 93 here. And if I did that, I would drop below the quota of 65. So player one would be considered critical or essential because if they leave the coalition becomes a losing coalition. And player 2 will do the same thing here, right? If I do 93 minus the 46 votes from player 2, I'll drop below the 65 that we need to pass a measure. So player 2 becomes critical. Do one more here with you. So we got player 1, player 2, player 3. They've got 110 combined votes. But if I take away the 47 votes that player 1 has, they would drop below 65. So player 1 becomes critical. Player 2 would also be critical here because 110 minus 46 is less than the 65 that you need to pass your measure. Okay. Player 3, however, would not be critical. If I did 110 minus 17, I would still be above 65 votes. So we don't really need player 3 in this coalition. They're not critical. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for each one. So I'm just going to go through and circle all of them that are critical. And like I said, you just have to kind of go through and test. It is tedious, but that is the process. So, all right, there we go. We got them all circled, so now we can see who's critical and who's not in all of the winning coalitions all at once. So now we're going to start calculating our power index. The first thing that you're going to want to do is just go through and count up how many times there was anyone that was critical. So how many, essentially you're counting how many circles you made as you went through the coalitions. And when I went through, I counted up 27 of them. Okay, so I'm just going to write that down. I'm going to keep that 27 for later. And then we're going to do player 1 first. Okay, so I'm just going to count up the number of times that player 1 was critical. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So 9 times player 1 was critical. So that is 9 out of the 27 times that anyone was critical. And if you reduce that to a decimal, you'll get 0.33 repeating, which means 33.33% of the total power belongs to player 1. Then I would do the same thing for player 2. I'd go through and count up all the times that player 2 was critical, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. I'm missing one here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. 7 of them. Right, so we have 7 out of 27, which is 0.259, if you put that into your calculator, for 25.9% of the power. And then we're going to repeat for each player. So player 3 had 5, which would be 5 out of 27, which would give us 0.185 or 18.5% of the power. Player 4, remember player 4 had 16 votes, and they were essential 3 times. So 3 out of 27 for 0.111, repeating, for 11.1% of the power. Right, and then our last player, player 5 with the 2 votes, was actually critical 3 times. And that would be 3 out of 27 for 0.111, just like the last one, for 11.1% of the power. And there we go. Now we have our power index. So remember from yesterday, we had talked about using this power index to identify dictators and dummies and vetoes. So no one has 100% of the power, so there's no dictators. No dictators. There are no dummies, because no one in our index has 0% of the power, so there's no dictators, no dummies. And then for veto, we would look for somebody that is circled in every single one of our winning coalitions. And we can see right away that there's not going to be anyone with veto power, because I have a winning coalition right here, and no one was essential in that one, not even player 1. So no one has veto power. All right. Another interesting note about how this election panned out for the parliament, you might notice that player 4 had 16 votes and player 5 had 5 votes, and they still ended up with the same amount of power. Just another demonstration that the actual weight that you carry in a weighted election does not really mean a whole lot in terms of power. Okay, this person has 8 times the number of votes as player 5, and they still ended up with the same amount of power. This is why it's important to make sure that you understand, like, how do you know how much power you have, and that's what Bonsoft tells us. So you know exactly where you stand in a weighted voting situation. Okay, and I kind of summarize most of that here for you. I give you the breakdown of the power index, and then talk about the different scenarios that we see in that power index there. Okay. All right, so try it now 3. What we're going to do for this one is I want you to try and work through this one on your own rather than talking you through every single detail. I'm just going to go ahead and write down what you should be getting each step of the way. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to list all of the winning coalitions. And yes, you're going to have to do this one yourself. All right, and you should practice doing it. So see if you can go through and list all of the winning coalitions. Remember, do it systematically. Try and start with the coalitions of 4 players first, and then work your way down to coalitions of 2 players, and see if you can get them all, and compare yourself, or compare what you get to what I get. Okay. All right, welcome back. So go ahead and take a minute, see if you got the coalitions. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 total winning coalitions, and I listed out the players in each one here for you. You can kind of see how I went through it. I did the 4-player coalition. That would be everybody voting yes all at once. So that is the 4-player coalition, which is an easy winner. And then I went through the 3-person coalition. So I went 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, and I was just systematic about testing out the different combinations of players, adding up their weights and seeing if they were in fact above 36. Okay. And once I felt like I got all of the 3-player coalitions, I went down to the 2-player coalition. So I did 1, 2, then 1, 3, and then when I tried to do like 2 and 3. All right, so if I did 2 and 3, like 17 and 16 here, that would only add up to 33. So I realized there was no 2-player combinations that were going to work without player 1. Okay, so I was able to eliminate some pretty quickly. So those are the tips and tricks I got for you if you ever have to list this out yourself. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to underline or circle all of the critical players in each of these winning coalitions. So again, I would pause the video, try and do it yourself, and see if you get the same ones that I do. All right, welcome back. So this is what I found for our essential or critical players in each of the coalitions. I think I got a total of 12 times that someone was critical. So now the next step of this problem is to go through and figure out how many times was player 1 specifically critical out of those 12 times. So if I were to go through, I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times that player 1 was critical out of 12. So I do 5 divided by 12, which is 0.4166 repeating for 41.67% of the power. And we're going to repeat the same thing for player 2, player 3, and player 4. All right, welcome back. So now you should be able to compare your final Banzhaf power index to my own. We can see that power distribution right away. Again, just some notes, things to practice. Even if I don't ask you to do them, it's just to say, hey, now that I have this Banzhaf power index, are there any dictators? Are there any dummies? Are there any veto powers? And there are no dictators. There are no dummies. I can see that. There's no 100s or zeros over here in my Banzhaf power index. And I have a coalition over here where no one is critical. So that means no one has veto power. And that's how quick it can go once you have that Banzhaf power index. All right, let's go to our next problem here. And this is example 7 in our note packet, and this one is kind of a big one. So I did the vast majority of this problem already. So what we have here, just to kind of set this up, this is Nassau County in New York, and there were some people who felt that the weighted voting system that was set up was extremely unfair. All right. Now the county is divided up into 6 districts, and they each get a voting weight that's proportional to the population in their respective district. Very similar to what we do for our electoral college for the presidential vote, right? We have a country, it's divided up into 50 states and I think 2 territories, and each of those players gets a certain amount of weight based on the population of their state, right? Which is why California gets so many electoral votes, but a state like Alaska does not. Okay, they only get a few electoral votes because their population is so low. So that's exactly what's happening here in this election. Hempstead is the largest district by population, so they get the most weight, while Glen Cove and Long Beach are 2 of the smallest districts by population, so they only get 2 votes. The question is whether or not that is an actual fair way to determine how much weight you get. All right. So I imagine that Long Beach and Glen Cove are the ones that are unhappy and they want to do this analysis to see what's going on. All right. So let's see what happens here. So we translated the weighted voting system here into our notation so that we can quickly analyze it. And then we list out all of the winning coalitions. And I've done that for you, so you don't have to worry about doing that here. Went through and underlined all of the essential players, right? So Hempstead 1 and Hempstead District 2, those are both critical. They're underlined instead of circled. So slightly different, but just a different symbol to mark who's critical and who's not. Right? So then all we have to do to figure this out is we just need to go through and count up the number of times that each district is critical, and then do the division and get the power index. All right, so let's see here. If we go through and we count up Hempstead District 1, you will find that they were critical 16 times. Okay? And then Hempstead 2 was also critical 16 times. And feel free to go through and count and see if you got the same numbers that I did here. Oyster Bay was also critical 16 times. And then North Hempstead, Long Beach, and Glen Cove were never critical. Right, so they were critical 0 times. So if I go through and I do this power index thing, what I'm going to end up doing here is I am going to do 16 divided by 48. There were 48 total players that I ended up underlining up there, and 16 out of 48 gives me 33% of the power, 33.33. We'll omit the decimals for now. Okay? And the same thing here, right? Because they all had the same number of critical times, so it's going to be 33, or 33% here. And then I would do the same thing and get another 33% here. And then obviously these guys would be 0 out of 48, so they're all going to have 0% of the power. And you start to see the major issue here. We have 3 districts in a weighted voting system that have absolutely no power. We have 3 dummies, and then we have 3 players up here that have all of the power. And this is just how things fell naturally in this voting system because of the way that the districts were populated. So I don't think there was an intention of being unfair, but I don't know if population is the best way to distribute weights. Okay, so if you look at this, they had 2 votes, but those 2 votes meant nothing because they ended up with 0% of the power. Even North Hempstead up here, who had 21 votes, still ended up with 0% of the power. Right? So and that's not okay. These districts need to have a say in what happens in their county. So it's very much like our electoral college system, where the number of electoral votes is tied to the amount of population you have, so to the amount of people that you have, but you also get an additional 2 votes in your weight for the number of senators that you have. And I think that they also modify some of the number of electoral college votes to ensure that no one ends up being a dummy in the electoral college system. Okay, so that's why you might have heard some debates about whether or not the Electoral College is fair, and I think it was intended to be fair based on population, but there's definitely some issues with the Electoral College. So one of the big things that people have is that California gets so many electoral votes because of their population, and then a state like Wyoming gets a certain number of electoral votes, and proportional to their population, Wyoming gets more electoral votes per population than California does. But that was, again, to ensure that Wyoming doesn't end up as a dummy in this weighted voting system. Same thing with the other low population states. They need to make sure that they have power in that weighted voting system.